Good morning. It is so good to be here this morning. If I have not met you yet, my name is Andrew Thetford, contrary to some popular confusion, not Andrew Hall. And I'm very excited to be here. I, like Cole and Andrew, were also at Lutz with the family there, and that was some very special time together. So I'm very thankful to see some old faces and as well as new faces from Citrus Park and from some students at Florida College. And I'm very thankful to be here. I appreciated all of, again, the emails and everyone reaching out beforehand. It was very encouraging, and I appreciate all the encouragement and support. Another thing that I appreciate is the careful planning and thought that went into this. I really love the theme of Lord, plant my feet on higher ground, because it's all about improving in our faith as Christians. What are some practical things we can improve on? So we've already heard some good lessons on that. The topic that I want to talk about this morning, as it was titled by, I believe it was Mr. Matt, is a forgiving spirit, which I really appreciate because forgiveness is more about forgiving people begrudgingly. You know, Jesus didn't go to the cross begrudgingly, but willingly, from his heart, a forgiving spirit, a forgiving heart. So my question this morning is, how can we develop that same heart, that same forgiving spirit that Jesus had? I would like to read from Matthew chapter 18 this morning. That'll be our focus, which it's actually funny that Cole read the section leading right up to this. So we've already got the context for it. Matthew chapter 18. And starting in verse 21, we're going to look at the parable of the unforgiving servant today. Personally, it is my favorite parable, so I'm looking forward to sharing the power and impact of Jesus' words here. This parable that Jesus shares here with Peter, specifically in the context, has greatly impacted and challenged me. So I'm looking forward to sharing it with you in the hopes that it will greatly impact and challenge you in your life. It's always had a very powerful impact on me because of the sheer absurdity that Jesus reveals in our lives of not forgiving others, and how he reveals that absurdity in my life. Let's pay attention to the words of the master teacher as we get started here. It starts with Peter coming up to Jesus and asking him a question. In verse 21, he says, "Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times?" Let's think about Peter's question. I think it's all too easy to skip right to Jesus' answer, his response, and to forget that 7 is already a lot of times to forgive somebody. Typically, if there's a friend who has wronged you, it already sets the relationship on edge. When somebody has wronged you 2 or 3 times, you would probably be called foolish or naive for continuing to forgive that person. And keep in mind, we're not talking about somebody bumping into you or stepping on your shoe, but we're talking about deep relational wounds that have been caused. After 2 or 3 times, most people would probably advise you to give up on that person or to avoid them in your daily life. I'm not exactly sure why Peter chose the number 7, but 7 is a lot of times to forgive somebody. So if you can imagine, Peter's probably going into this question thinking that 7 is a lot. However, look at Jesus' response to the question. In verse 22, after Peter asks how many times he should forgive, Jesus responds, "I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times." In Peter's mind, when he says as many as 7, he already words it like it's an absurd amount. Whether your translation says 77 times or 70 times 7, the number that Jesus responds with is truly a ridiculous amount. If we thought that 7 was absurd, the number that Jesus responds with is at minimum 11 times that absurd amount. It is in the context of these absurd numbers that Jesus brings us an absurd story in order to help both Peter and us to understand the absurd forgiveness that Jesus calls us to, and the absurd forgiveness that he showed for us. So Jesus begins the story in verse 23. Let's read. Verse 23 of Matthew 18. "Therefore the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold, with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything.' And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt." As we go throughout this parable, let's take note of the different absurd aspects of this story. First, this servant owes the king 10,000 talents. The numeral for 10,000 was the largest numeral that existed in the Greek language. Additionally, in their cultural setting, the talent was the most valuable monetary unit that existed, and it was worth about 20 years' wages for the average worker. So if you do the math, the amount that this servant owes here is roughly worth 200,000 years of work. Commentator R.C. Sproul tells us, to put this in perspective, that the annual revenue of Herod's entire kingdom was 900 talents. The servant owed the king more than 10 times the annual revenue of King Herod. What type of king lets a servant act so recklessly with his money? Additionally, how could a servant even build up this much debt, and how long would it have taken? For this debt to be possible, the king would have had to be either very, very foolish or very, very merciful. And so reasonably, what happens is this king no longer wants this servant to be his servant, and he orders him and his family and all of his possessions to be sold to someone else. However, as we read, the servant, out of options, falls to his knees, realizing that his only hope was in the mercy of the king. He begs, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." However, in this statement, we see even more absurdities. Two more. The servant first has the audacity to ask for patience. Again, it is not possible that this debt was all created in one day. The king has already been tremendously patient with this servant. Secondly, he claims that he's going to pay everything back to the king. There's not even the slightest chance that this servant could ever pay back the debt. And notice in the next verse that it is not because the king believes the servant's claim that he's going to pay him back. It's not because of that he forgives the debt, but it says it's because of pity. Or some translations say it's because of the compassion of the king that he forgives the debt. And so let's look at the facts. Let's get the facts straight real quick. This man has been possibly the worst servant to ever exist, wasting probably the most amount of money that has ever been wasted. He's not sold. He's not fired. He keeps his possessions, and he keeps his family. Not even that, but the king doesn't even tell the servant that he has to work and pay back the debt. And so this massive, impossibly unpayable debt is completely forgiven. He has wasted so much, abused his position, and has gotten away with absolutely no consequence, all because of the compassion and the mercy of the king. Putting yourself in this man's shoes, you can imagine how joyful and how free he should have felt. Unfortunately, though, that's not what we see. The rich freedom and joy of this parable don't last very long. Look at the next verse. Let's continue. In verse 28, it says, "But when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, 'Pay what you owe.' So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, saying, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you.' But he refused and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt." How could he do this? How could this servant possibly act this way? His reaction has always just blown my mind. I've never understood it. In a moment equally as absurd as the king's irrational forgiveness, immediately after begging on his knees for mercy, this servant turns around, and as soon as he steps out of the door, finds a fellow servant who owes him 600,000 times less than what he owed. And without warning, he seizes him and he chokes him. Again, I don't know what your reaction is to this parable, but to me, it's infuriating. And this is the reason why this is my favorite parable, because it strikes me so hard. And I think that Jesus does this intentionally. Like Nathan's parable to David in 2 Samuel 12, Jesus takes a highly sensitive topic, and indeed a very difficult one and a very personal one to all of us, forgiveness. It's not easy to do. But he takes this highly sensitive topic and he places it within a story so we can clearly see things as they really are. To think that somebody could be shown that much mercy in such a hopeless and vulnerable time of their life, and then could turn around and find someone in the exact same position, again, hopeless and vulnerable, in need of that same mercy, and not only deny them that mercy by forgiving the debt, or even by giving him more time to pay the debt, but to act in anger towards that person. Brothers and sisters in Christ, it is this absurdity that Jesus is revealing within our own lives. That in the most hopeless and vulnerable times of our lives, it was and is nothing except the compassion and the mercy of the King that sets us free, that has set us free and still sets us free from our hopelessness and the debt caused by our devotion to selfishness and sin. But here's the hard part. This is easy to talk about and understand right now, but sometimes in life we start to do pretty good, and we start to feel like I'm a pretty good person. Almost like I'm worthy of the mercy and the compassion of God. And it's in those moments when we feel like we have the right to put ourselves in the seat of the judge and to give that person who wronged us what they deserve. It is in those moments when we, myself included, have the audacity to, right after being dependent on the mercy of God, and while still being dependent on the mercy and the grace of God, that we look another human being in the eyes and decide that they don't deserve my forgiveness. And maybe we wouldn't say it exactly like that, but many times the unforgiving heart that we have is revealed in the way that we treat people and the way we talk about people. If you're an FC student in particular, notice the way that you talk about people. Do you talk about people with hope that they'll grow? Or do we just assume their intentions and assume that they'll never change or never grow? Thank God that he was willing to, in the depths of my sin and darkness, offer me his compassion and mercy. Thank God that he is still willing to offer me his compassion and his mercy. The absurd compassion that we were shown has given us life, hope, and purpose. And the compassion that we are able to show has the power to give that same life, hope, and purpose to others. May it never be that we ever look at a fellow human being struggling in their sin and in their selfishness, in need of that same compassion and mercy, and withhold from them the same mercy that saved me from my sin and my selfishness. This is a beautiful and a powerful truth that Jesus has revealed to us in this parable. In this short story of the immeasurable mercy of a king and of a servant who is unchanged by the immeasurable mercy of a king, Jesus reveals how immensely foolish it is for us to judge others without mercy. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 2, Jesus famously says, "For with the judgment that you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." He's telling us that if we judge others in mercy, we will be judged in mercy. If we choose to judge others in justice, then we will receive justice. However, if we do choose to judge others by the principle of justice, giving them what they deserve, then God is certainly going to give us what we deserve. Or as James puts it in James chapter 2, verse 13, he says, "Judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy." Mercy triumphs over judgment. One of the professors at Florida College, Tom Hamilton, offered an important insight to me. He said that we tend to judge others by their actions, but we judge ourselves by our intentions. He used the example of an elderly person in a hospital, and maybe I have every intention to visit that elderly person, right? But because of the car breaking down or a busy weekend or for some other reason, I'm not able to visit the person in the hospital. And I judge myself mercifully, saying, well, at least I had good intentions to visit the person in the hospital. But the fact is that I didn't visit that person, period. However, whenever I'm the one laying in the hospital and nobody comes to visit me, I assume their intentions. I assume that nobody came to visit me because they're all just uncaring people. That's just who they are. But again, that's not how we want others to judge others. That's not how we want others to judge us. When somebody has wronged me, that person should get what they deserve. But when I've wronged somebody, I hope that person will show me mercy. When somebody cuts me off while driving, it's because they're a terrible and inconsiderate person. But whenever I accidentally cut somebody off, it was just an accident, or I had to. Dr. Hamilton also made the point that I believe rings true for myself, that no matter how much damage a person has caused in my life by whatever wrongful action they committed against me, the person who has caused the most damage in my life is me. Why is it that I'm able to judge myself mercifully and to forgive myself the countless times that I've caused damage in the lives of others and in my own life because of my foolishness? Why is it that I'm able to forgive myself, reconcile with myself, and say, okay, Andrew, I know you did something stupid, but I'll give you another chance because I have hope that you'll do better and you'll improve. You'll get better. But I give up on others so much easier than I do myself. Jesus calls me to love others as I love myself. For some of you, maybe loving yourself is difficult. Even greater than that command, Jesus later calls us to love others the same way that he has loved us. This is what the first servant was unable to do. Whenever he saw the second servant vulnerable, in a vulnerable position, distressed and hopeless, and begging on his knees in mercy, he was unable to recognize that 2 minutes ago, he was in that exact same position, humbled to his knees, indebted and dependent on the mercy of someone else. It is only through seeking to understand others that we will consequently be able to develop the empathy and the compassion for others that the King had for us. That is the key to developing a forgiving heart and a forgiving spirit within ourselves. Coming back to the parable in Matthew 18, let's continue reading. In verse 31, it says, when his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. When his master summoned him and said, you wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you? And in anger, his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. Again, notice the intense emotions of this parable. The other servants see this cruel interaction, and they are greatly distressed. And again, I believe that this is the reaction that Jesus was going for in this parable, that we would be greatly distressed because of this vile misuse of the mercy in this story. Because of this absurd cruelty, these servants are greatly distressed and go to the master, who is also infuriated at the news. He then gives the unmerciful servant the justice that he desired. Those who judge in mercy will be judged in mercy, but those who judge with justice will receive justice. Now that we have been shown the mercy of the King expects us to see others as being in the same position as us, in need of that same mercy and grace. If God has forgiven somebody, who am I to withhold that forgiveness from them? Lastly, what we read after the story are the difficult and challenging words of Jesus. In verse 35, so also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. If you do not forgive your brother from your heart. I don't know about you, but to me, that statement is intimidating. What if I'm trying to forgive somebody, but my heart just hasn't? And so that's really the focus of today, developing that forgiving heart, that forgiving spirit. Because some of you might be sitting in the pew today, and this might not be a current problem for you. Maybe you haven't been seriously wronged recently, or even better, maybe you have forgiven those who have wronged you. However, for some of you in the audience, you might be in the middle of a very difficult situation where maybe somebody has wronged you, and maybe that wrong has caused a deep, irreversible wound. Now, I can imagine that if you are in that situation, that Jesus' words here telling you to forgive that person from your heart are not easy to hear and astronomically more difficult to live out. However, these words do not come from a faceless wise man who wants to control how you live. These words come from the lips of the suffering servant and king, Jesus. These words come from a man who understood his own message of mercy in such an intimate way that he not only spoke it, but lived it out, no matter the cost. These words come from a man who knew and understood just how difficult it was to forgive those who have deeply wounded you. These words come from a man who knew the pain, the deep pain of being betrayed by a trusted disciple, but was still willing to look him in the eyes and call him friend. These words come from a man who, after being abandoned by his disciples and betrayed by his own people, was still willing to go to the cross to save the very people that put him on the cross. These words come from a man who, even while he was being shamefully and painfully crucified on that cross, was willing to make one last request. Father, forgive them. The type of forgiveness that Jesus calls us to is not a forgiveness that makes sense. The type of love that Jesus calls us to is not a love that makes sense. In fact, we can expect to be called foolish and naive for truly living out Jesus' type of forgiveness. To the world, the cross was and is foolishness. But to us who have been saved, we understand the power of that foolishness. But to us who have been saved, we understand the power of that mercy and that compassion. In the parable of the unforgiving servant, one could legitimately argue that the king is exceptionally foolish for forgiving 10,000 talents of debt. What type of king does that? And from a logical and economical point of view, yes, it was a terrible decision. Yet, because of the compassion of the king, and for no other reason, he was willing to show mercy. Notice what Paul says in Romans chapter 2, verse 4, because this is where the servants went wrong. This is where the first servant went wrong, and this is where we can go wrong whenever we forget what God's kindness, what God's grace and his mercy is designed to do in our lives. In Romans chapter 2, verse 4, Paul says, "Do you presume on the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance?" Ultimately, God does not simply desire that we will accept his kindness. Ultimately, what God desires for his people is that we will not only accept his kindness, but be changed by it. It is only when we allow our hearts to be radically transformed by the mercy that we have received. It is only then that we will be able to show that mercy to our debtors from our hearts. It is only then that we will be able to understand the true value of the mercy that our King values so much more than any debt. It is only then that we will be able to understand the true, immeasurable value of irrationally, incomprehensibly, and foolishly forgiving others. Now, I understand that there is a danger of misunderstanding Jesus' words here, so I want to clarify something. I believe that there is an important difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. It takes one to forgive, but it takes two to reconcile. I do not believe that immediate reconciliation is always possible. Some actions cannot be reversed and have lasting consequences. Some actions cause irreversible wounds that will not go away quickly or easily. And I'd be happy to discuss the difficulties of this topic with you afterwards. But for this moment, let us not miss the powerful truth of Jesus' messages here. That we are called to radically forgive others from the heart as God has forgiven us. Lastly, I would like to conclude with a story that I heard recently, and it impacted me greatly. In 1963, Hector Black, he was a white Tennessee farmer, and he wanted to support the civil rights movement. So he moved to Atlanta, Georgia, into a low-income African-American neighborhood. And in this neighborhood, a young girl named Patricia latched onto Hector's family. She didn't have family to take care of her and was in desperate need of help. They would frequently take her in, give her food, and treat her as one of their own daughters. And they eventually ended up adopting her as their own daughter. However, like our parable, this story takes a dark turn. Patricia grew up, and then in 2001, an intruder broke into the family's house, stealing for his drug addiction. However, when Patricia came home from work that day, the intruder was hiding in a closet, and she ended up opening the closet and being knocked to the ground. And the man told her to get better security for their house, and she told this man to get better help with his drug addiction. After the man was unable to get what he wanted from Patricia, he strangled, murdered, and took advantage of her. Patricia's father, Hector Black, as you can imagine, like the king in our parable, was furious. He said that he wanted this man to hurt in the same way that their family was hurt, and in the same way that she hurt, and in the same way that he hurt. And if you're like me, you probably hear his reaction and think, yeah, that makes complete and total sense. This guy should get justice. This guy should get what he deserves. However, Hector said that after a while, he began to wonder how any human being could possibly commit such an inhumane, disgusting, and cruel act. Hector wanted to learn about the intruder, Ivan Simpson. Ivan had had a very difficult life. One of the things that Hector learned is that when Ivan was a child, his mother brought him, his brother, and his sister to a pool, and claiming that God had ordered her to destroy them, attempted to kill all three of her children. He and his brother escaped, but he watched his sister be drowned by his own mother. As Hector learned more about this man's life, it didn't reverse what had been done. It didn't take away the severe pain that had been caused by Ivan's actions. However, what did happen is that Hector began to understand how lost Ivan was. As he sought to understand Ivan, he began to develop empathy and compassion for Ivan. Hector ended up going to the district attorney's office to request that Ivan Simpson might not receive the death penalty. Later in court, Black's family members were allowed to read a statement about how they had been affected by the tragedy. And it went through the different family members, and they were stating how much they hated Ivan Simpson and how terrible it was what he did, and how they could never forgive the terrible thing that he had done. However, whenever it got to Hector's turn to speak, he said, "I don't hate you, Ivan Simpson, but I hate with all my soul what you did to my daughter." He looked into Ivan Simpson's eyes, and there were tears streaming down his cheeks. And before he was led away, Simpson apologized twice for the pain that he had caused. And Black, in an interview, said that he couldn't sleep that night. He wrote a letter to Ivan telling him that he had forgiven him. In an interview regarding that night, Hector Black said, "I really felt as though a tremendous weight had been lifted from me and that I had forgiven him." This type of forgiveness is not easy. And at the end of the day, forgiveness cannot reverse the wrongful action, that was committed. But through the forgiveness that Hector showed, he was able to begin the process of healing in both his life and Ivan's. It has been observed by many that withholding forgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I'm not here to tell you that everyone here has done something as terrible as Ivan Simpson, but what I am here to tell you is that all of us, at some point in our lives, whether that's in the past or whether that's now, that all of us at some point were enslaved to sin and selfishness, unable to see past our own desires and struggles. However, it was the compassion. It was the compassion of the King. It was the mercy of the King that set us free. Paul says in Galatians 5:13 that you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love, serve one another. This type of forgiveness is not easy. This type of forgiveness cannot fix all the damage that has been caused. But this type of forgiveness, manifested fully at the cross, has the power to transform lives. I hope that today this parable has changed you. I hope that today this powerful parable of Jesus has impacted and challenged the way that you think about and judge others in the same way that it has impacted and challenged the way that I think about others. Thank God for the teachings of Jesus that we have, and that he in such a powerful way has revealed God's will for his people. My prayer is that we will all become more like Jesus in the way that we forgive people from our hearts. This radical forgiveness that we have been discussing is freely available to every single person in the audience today, no matter your background. Whether you owe 100 denarii or 10,000 talents, there is no way to pay back your debt. But luckily, that is not what God desires for us to do. The gospel that we believe in is not the gospel of earning your way to heaven by doing enough good things to pay back your debt. The gospel that we believe in is the gospel of forgiveness, where all debt is completely forgiven, with the goal of true reconciliation with our all-powerful God who desires to be in relationship with his children. If at this time you would like to accept his forgiveness and to be reconciled with the one true God through baptism, please come forward as we stand and as we sing.